Drax's 3 hearts hammered against her rib cage as she crouched behind the crumbling ruins of a fallen skyscraper. Her dark form melded into the shadows, her sharp vision scanning the wasteland of the once prosperous human city, now reduced to skeletal remains of concrete and twisted metal. Xyrus 4, once a jewel in the Terran Alliance, was now just another battlefield in the endless war between humans and the USCA. Her mission was clear: infiltrate the human settlement, retrieve the intelligence chip containing their latest military strategy, and return to her war fleet undetected. Simple. Her kind had been doing this for centuries, and she had been bred for exactly this purpose: silent, lethal, and precise. USCA assassins like Drax were feared across the galaxy, their skills in espionage and infiltration unmatched. But something had gone wrong. The humans had been waiting for her, or at least someone like her. They had set a trap, and she had barely escaped. Now she was being hunted by one of their soldiers, a tracker, relentless and clever. Not clever enough to find her, though. Not yet. The wind howled through the shattered buildings, carrying with it the acrid scent of burning fuel and decay. Drax's senses were heightened, her mind alert to every sound, every shift in the environment. Her scaled body, shimmering with faint green and silver hues, was designed to adapt, to blend in with her surroundings. Her cloaking device was damaged in the chase, but she could still rely on her natural stealth to remain undetected, at least for now. Her twin tails curled beneath her, ready to spring into action at the slightest hint of danger. Her claws, sharp as blades, flexed against the gritty surface of the ground. She had been in tighter spots before and survived, but there was something different about this human. He wasn't just a mindless soldier blindly following orders. He was hunting her with a purpose, and that unsettled her. Drax's sharp, reptilian eyes flicked toward a movement in the distance. There, on the edge of the shattered square where the skeletal remains of an old market stood, the human appeared. He moved with precision, his tall, muscular frame almost too fluid for someone encased in such heavy combat armor. His weapon was sleek. His weapon, humming with energy, was raised in front of him, scanning for any sign of her. Drax had faced countless humans in combat, but there was something different about this one. He wasn't reckless like many of his kind, nor was he firing blindly into the ruins, hoping to flush her out. Instead, he moved methodically, his eyes scanning the area with an unsettling calmness. Drax's predatory instincts told her this one was dangerous. She had expected them to send reinforcements when the mission was compromised. What she hadn't expected was a single human tracking her through the ruins with such determination. It didn't make sense. Humans weren't known for their patience or their skill in hunting her kind. They were brutes, relying on superior numbers and overwhelming firepower. Yet this one moved like an assassin, like one of her own. Her hearts raced faster as he drew nearer, his steps barely audible over the distant echoes of explosions from the outskirts of the city. He was getting too close. Her mind raced with calculations. She could pounce, eliminate him silently, and continue with her mission. It was the logical course of action. Yet something in the back of her mind stopped her. What was he doing? Suddenly, he stopped just a few meters from her hiding spot. The human knelt down, running his gloved hand across the dusty ground. He wasn't looking at her, but Drax knew he could sense her presence. His helmet turned slightly as if he could hear her breathing, even though she had been trained to be utterly silent. "Come out," his voice rang through the stillness, low and steady, not a demand but an invitation. Drax's eyes narrowed. A trick, perhaps? Humans were known for their deceptive tactics. Yet there was something about his tone, something calm, almost curious. He wasn't shouting or threatening her. He wasn't calling for reinforcements or preparing to strike. His weapon was still lowered. This didn't make sense. He had every advantage, and yet he wasn't taking it. Her instincts screamed at her to kill him now, to tear through his armor and end the standoff before it began. Yet her body remained still. Something deeper, something unfamiliar, urged her to wait, to see what he would do. "I know you're there," the human continued, his voice steady. "I can feel it. I don't want to fight you." The words caught her off guard. No human had ever spoken to her like that before. They were always filled with anger, hatred, bent on killing her or her kind. But this one was different. Drax slowly uncloaked herself, the shimmering distortion around her body fading away as she stepped from behind the crumbling pillar. Her tall, sleek frame emerged from the shadows, her red glowing eyes locking onto his. Her twin tails swayed behind her, a warning, though she kept her claws retracted for now. The human remained still, his helmeted head tilting slightly as if studying her. His weapon remained lowered, though Drax knew it could be raised in an instant. "You're not like the others," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Why aren't you trying to kill me?" He stood slowly, straightening to his full height, though he didn't attempt to move closer. "Maybe because I don't need to," he replied. Drax's mind reeled. Don't need to? Was this some kind of human trick? Did he think he could talk his way out of this? She was ESA trained from birth to be a lethal weapon. Her purpose was to kill, to complete the mission, and yet here she stood, facing a human who wasn't following the script. Her claws flexed instinctively, the tips glinting in the pale light. She could end this now, one quick strike, and he would be dead before he had a chance to react. But something in his eyes, something behind that visor, stopped her. "What do you want?" Drax demanded, her voice edged with suspicion. "I want to understand," he replied simply. "I've been fighting your kind for years, but we've never spoken." "Not really. And now I've got you here, and I'm wondering, why does it always have to be like this?" Drax blinked, momentarily thrown by his words. No human had ever asked her that. Her kind didn't speak with humans. They didn't negotiate or try to understand them. They killed and they survived. "I could kill you," she growled, more to remind herself than him. "You could," he agreed, his voice unervingly calm, "but you haven't." Drax felt a flicker of something deep within her, something unfamiliar, something she didn't like. Her body tensed, ready to strike, but her mind hesitated. Why hadn't she killed him yet? He took a step closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We don't have to fight. Not here, not now." Drax's breathing quickened, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She had been trained to see humans as the enemy, nothing more. They were targets, obstacles in the grand plan of the ESA. And yet, this human wasn't behaving like an enemy. He wasn't trying to kill her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. Her mission was clear, but in this moment, for reasons she couldn't understand. She couldn't understand. She didn't want to complete it. The air between them hung heavy, thick with the tension of unspoken intentions. Drax's muscles remained coiled, her claws still flexed, ready to strike at a moment's notice. She could feel the hum of her instincts urging her to act, to kill the human standing so calmly before her. But there was something about him, something unsettling, something that made her hesitate. "My name is Lieutenant Corin Ville," the human said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, low, almost too calm for a man in the presence of a trained USCA assassin. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat, though every sense in Drax's body screamed that he was. "I don't care what your name is," Drax spat, her eyes narrowing into slits. Her twin tails twitched behind her, coiling and uncoiling as she tried to make sense of the situation. "You're the enemy. That's all that matters." Corin took a slow step forward, his movement deliberate, cautious. His weapon was still strapped to his side, but Drax knew he could raise it in less than a second if things went wrong. Yet he hadn't. The absurdity of the moment wasn't lost on her. She was an elite USCA assassin standing face to face with a human soldier who hadn't even drawn his weapon. "I could be your enemy," Corin said, his eyes locked on hers. "But I don't have to be." The words sounded simple, but their meaning felt layered, complex. Drax had spent her entire life being trained to view humans as nothing more than prey, weak, emotional creatures driven by greed and ambition. Her instructors had drilled into her that the USCA were superior, evolved beyond the need for such foolishness. And yet, here stood a human who was talking to her not as prey, but as an equal. Her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. "You think I'm going to trust you? A human?" "I don't expect you to trust me," Corin replied, his voice calm, almost maddeningly so. "I expect you to listen. You can kill me if you want. I'm not going to stop you. But maybe, just maybe, we don't have to do this." Drax laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the ruins around them. "We're at war, human. Your kind has been trying to exterminate mine for over a decade, and you think one conversation changes that?" Corin didn't flinch. "You think your kind hasn't been doing the same? How many of us have you killed? How many human cities have the USCA destroyed? We're both guilty. But here, right now, we have a choice." The word choice rattled around in Drax's mind like a loose screw. Her entire life had been devoid of choice. She was bred for a purpose: to kill, to complete missions, to serve her people. There were no options, no alternatives. The USCA lived by order, by efficiency. They didn't waste time with meaningless ideals like compassion or mercy. And yet, here was a human offering her something she didn't understand: a choice. "What are you playing at?" Drax asked, her voice low, dangerous. "This is a trick, some kind of psychological warfare. You're trying to mess with my head." Corin shook his head, taking another cautious step closer. "No tricks. I don't want to fight you. I want to understand." "Understand what?" Drax's eyes flicked over his face, trying to read his expressions, trying to find some hint of deception. But all she saw was sincerity, something she wasn't used to seeing in the eyes of an enemy. "We're soldiers. We kill each other. There's nothing more to understand." "I think there is," Corin said softly. "We've been fighting for so long, we've forgotten why we started. You're not like the others I've fought. You're different." Drax felt a flicker of irritation. "How am I different? I'm USCA. You know what we are." Corin's gaze remained steady. "I've fought your kind before. They're cold, methodical. But you're not killing me, even though you could." "Why?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no answer came. Her claws flexed at her sides, her tails coiling restlessly behind her. She should have killed him already. She could have easily ended this standoff the moment she uncloaked herself. Yet something about his calm demeanor, his lack of aggression, held her in place. His voice, his words, they made her feel something alien, something unsettling: doubt. "I've killed plenty of humans," Drax finally said, her voice rough. "You're nothing special." Corin nodded as if he understood. "Maybe. But we're not just soldiers. We're people, and I think you've spent so long fighting, you've forgotten that." "People." The word felt strange to Drazik. The USCA weren't people, not in the way humans defined it. They were warriors, a species honed for war. Emotions were a weakness, a distraction from the mission. But Corin's words dug at something deep inside her, something she had buried long ago. She had never thought of herself as more than a weapon. "I don't need your philosophy," she hissed, trying to push away the strange emotions bubbling up inside her. "We're not the same." Corin's eyes softened, and he took a small step closer. "Aren't we?" Drazik's muscles tensed as he moved toward her, but she didn't lash out. Her instincts told her she should be on the offensive, that this human was trying to manipulate her, but something about his calm, steady presence kept her rooted to the spot. She watched him carefully, her red eyes locked on his every movement. He wasn't like the other humans she had encountered: wild, unpredictable, filled with hatred. Corin's gaze wasn't filled with violence, but with curiosity. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, not like she was an enemy, but something he wanted to understand. Her mind screamed at her to kill him, to finish the mission and return to the safety of her people. But her body betrayed her, staying still, waiting. Corin's voice dropped to a near whisper. "We don't have to be enemies, Drazik. Not here. Not right now." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her. How did he know it? Her species never shared their names with outsiders. And yet, he had said it like it was a secret they both knew. Her head swam with confusion. How could this human know her? "What are you really after?" she demanded, her voice betraying the uncertainty she was trying to hide. "Why are you talking to me like this?" Corin lowered his weapon completely, slinging it over his shoulder. It was a gesture of trust, but also of vulnerability. He was giving her the upper hand, something no human had ever done. He stepped closer, his face unreadable behind the visor of his helmet, but his voice was soft, disarming. I'm after the same thing you are, he said. Survival. Drazik's lip curled into a sneer. Then why aren't you fighting for it? I am, Corin replied. But not every fight has to end in blood. She stared at him, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He was giving her an option she had never considered, one she wasn't even sure she understood. Her entire life had been built around the idea that survival meant eliminating threats, completing missions, and following orders. This human, with his calm words and disarming presence, was challenging everything she had been taught. Drazik took a step back, her eyes darting around the ruined city. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was USCA, an assassin bred for war, and yet here she was, standing in the ruins of a human colony, talking to the very creature she should have killed minutes ago. Her claws retracted, though her body remained tense, ready to strike if this was all some elaborate ruse, but Corin didn't make a move toward her. He just stood there, waiting, watching. I could kill you, she said again, as if reminding herself of the truth. I know, Corin said softly, but you won't. Something inside Drazik snapped. She lunged forward, her claws raised, but instead of striking him down, she stopped just short of his throat. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling with an emotion she couldn't place. His helmeted face was mere inches from hers, and yet he didn't flinch, didn't reach for his weapon. Why won't I? She demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and confusion. Corin didn't back away. Because you want more than just this war. His words struck her like a physical blow. Drazik stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never wanted anything other than to serve her people, to complete her missions. But something in his voice and his eyes made her question that truth. What are you offering? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Corin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out his hand, hovering it in the air between them, as if offering her something more than just survival. A choice, he said finally. I'm offering you a choice. Drazik stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting instincts and emotions. She had spent her entire life as a weapon, forged in the fires of war, honed for precision and lethality. There had never been room for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that could slow her hand when it was time to strike. Yet here she was, face to face with a human who had disarmed her not with weapons, but with words. Her claws remained at her side, sharp and deadly but unused. She could still feel the tension coiling in her muscles, the readiness to attack ingrained in her very biology. Yet something inside her held her back. Lieutenant Corinville stood just a breath away, his hand outstretched, offering something that felt alien to her, something far more dangerous than any weapon: vulnerability. You don't have to kill me, Corin said quietly, his voice calm and disarming in its simplicity. You don't have to fight. Drazik's twin tails twitched behind her, betraying her inner turmoil. Her scaled body shimmered faintly under the dim light filtering through the ruins. She could feel every beat of her three hearts pulsing out of sync as confusion, anger, and something else, something she didn't recognize, fought for dominance within her. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever made her question her purpose. Her claws flexed involuntarily, and Corin's eyes flicked toward them, though his posture didn't change. He was still standing there, just waiting, as if his fate was entirely in her hands. Drazik could end him in a heartbeat, tear through his armor, and complete the mission she had been sent here for. It would be so easy. But something strange happened instead. Her eyes locked onto his hand, still hovering in the space between them. There was no weapon in it, no threat, just a hand. A human hand. It was strange how alien something so simple could feel to her. She had never touched a human before, not like this, not without the intent to kill. Drazik took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate, as if testing some unseen boundary. Her instincts screamed at her to stop, to kill him and be done with it. But something deeper, something primal and unidentifiable, pushed her forward. Her claws, sharp and gleaming, slowly retracted as she raised her own hand to meet his. When her fingertips brushed against Corin's skin, an electric jolt shot through her body. His skin was soft, warmer than she had imagined. The Izar were cold-blooded, their bodies adapted to absorb and store heat from the environment. But humans, they generated their own heat, a warmth that radiated from him in waves. Her mind couldn't process the sensation immediately, but her body responded instinctively. A sharp breath escaped Drazik's lips as her hand met his. His fingers curled slightly around hers, not in a grip, but in a gentle, reassuring touch. It was unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't combat. It was something entirely foreign to her kind. "What are you doing?" Drazik whispered, her voice hoarse, trembling in a way that shocked her. She had never heard herself like this, so unsure, so vulnerable. Corrin's eyes softened, though his hand remained steady. "I'm showing you we don't have to be enemies," he said gently, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Drazik blinked, her mind reeling. His words didn't make sense. They were supposed to be enemies, two soldiers from opposing sides of a brutal, unforgiving war. The mission had always been clear: infiltrate, retrieve, kill if necessary, and escape. There was no room for connection. No room for this. She looked down at their hands, still connected, and her mind struggled to understand what was happening. His touch wasn't meant to hurt her. It wasn't an attack. And despite her initial wariness, she found herself unwilling, unable, to pull away. For the first time in her life, Drazik felt something other than the cold, calculated purpose of her existence. A warmth spread through her, starting where their skin touched and moving slowly, like a slow burn. It was unsettling, intoxicating. She didn't understand it, but she didn't want it to stop. Her breathing quickened, and for a brief moment, she let herself wonder, what if it didn't have to be this way? What if there was more to life than the endless cycle of death and survival? "You're not like the others," she muttered, barely recognizing her own voice. "Humans. Your kind. They're violent. Why are you different?" Corrin hesitated, as if searching for the right words. His thumb brushed against the back of her hand, sending another unfamiliar ripple of sensation through her. "I've seen enough violence to last a lifetime. I'm tired of it. I think we all are, deep down." Drazik's eyes searched his, trying to find some trace of deceit, but there was none. He was speaking the truth, or at least his truth. She had never thought of humans as being capable of such thoughts. To her, they were nothing more than primitive beings driven by their basest instincts. But Corrin was different. He didn't see her as a monster or an enemy. He saw her as something more. "You could kill me," Corrin said softly, repeating her own words from earlier. "But you haven't." Drazik swallowed hard, her throat tight. She didn't know why she hadn't. It would have been so easy. It still could be. But her hand remained in his, their connection deepening with every passing second. And with it, the sharp edges of her world, the certainty, the rigidness, began to blur. "I don't understand," Drazik finally admitted, her voice cracking with frustration. This isn't how things are supposed to go." Corrin smiled, just the faintest curve of his lips. "Maybe that's a good thing." His words struck her harder than any weapon could have. She had lived her entire life according to the rules laid down by her people, by the war that had defined everything she knew. But now, standing in the ruins of a human city with her hand in his, she was beginning to realize that perhaps those rules weren't as unbreakable as she had once believed. Her eyes flicked down to their hands again. His fingers were still resting lightly on hers, and she found herself wanting to explore that touch further. She didn't understand why, but the need was undeniable. Her body was responding to him in ways she didn't fully comprehend, but she couldn't deny the warmth that was growing between them, both physically and emotionally. Slowly, almost tentatively, Drazik took another step forward, closing the remaining distance between them. Her other hand lifted, hesitating for a moment before it rested against his chest. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his armor, the warmth of his body radiating through the material. It felt real, grounding. Corrin didn't move, didn't push her away. He simply waited, letting her set the pace as if he understood the storm of emotions raging inside her. His breath was steady, calm, even as she leaned in closer. "What is this?" Drazik whispered, her voice filled with confusion and something else, something raw and unspoken. Corrin's breath brushed against her ear, warm and reassuring. "It's what it means to be human." The word sent a shiver down Drazik's spine. Human. She had never thought of humanity as something desirable, something she might want to understand. And yet, here she was, standing in the middle of a ruined battlefield, craving something more than survival, craving this strange, alien connection. Her claws, once poised to strike him down, now rested gently against his chest. The danger was still there, coiled within her, but it was fading, replaced by something softer, something she had never allowed herself to feel. "I don't know if I can trust you," Drazik admitted, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to," Corin replied, his voice a soft murmur. "Just trust yourself." Trust herself? Drazik's mind whirled at the thought. She had never been taught to trust herself, only the mission, only the orders of her commanders. But now, for the first time, she was being asked to make her own choice, to decide what mattered. The warmth of Corin's touch, the steady beat of his heart against her hand, and the quiet intimacy of the moment were unlike anything she had ever experienced. She didn't know what this was, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. Drazik looked up into Corin's eyes, her breath catching as their gazes locked. In that moment, everything else fell away. The war, the mission, the violence. All that remained was the two of them standing in the ruins of a forgotten city, discovering something neither of them had expected. And for the first time in her life, Drazik felt something she had never thought possible. She felt human. The ruins of the city stood eerily silent around them, the distant echoes of the war beyond their small enclave seeming a world away. Drazik had never felt time slow like this before, as if the weight of the universe was pressing down on this single moment between her and the human. For a long time, all she could hear was the steady, rhythmic beating of Corin's heart beneath her hand, a sound so alien, so real. His breath was warm, the scent of him filling the space between them, and she had no idea why she hadn't already ended him. Every part of her combat training screamed that this was a fatal mistake. She could almost hear the harsh voices of her commanders scolding her, telling her that she had lost focus and that her empathy, if it could even be called that, was weakness. And yet, standing here inches from Corin Vale, Drazik felt stronger than she had ever felt before. The power wasn't in her claws or in her ability to end a life with ease. It was in the choice to pull away from the violence that had defined her existence. And in doing so, she realized she wasn't just defying her training. She was defying her entire species' way of life. Corin's voice, low and gentle, broke through her swirling thoughts. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his hand still resting lightly against hers. "This doesn't have to be the only way." Drazik blinked, her gaze searching his face, trying to make sense of the emotions crashing through her like a storm. His eyes weren't filled with fear, and there was no malice in them, only understanding, only the kind of quiet confidence that made her heart clench with something she wasn't ready to name. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice rough and uneven. "What do you mean, the only way?" Corin's hand gently lifted, his fingertips brushing against her jawline so lightly that she almost flinched at the unfamiliar intimacy. But she didn't. Instead, her body leaned into the touch, a response she had no control over. He wasn't offering violence. He wasn't offering threats. What he was offering was something that terrified her far more. "War doesn't have to be everything," Corin said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that tugged at something deep inside. "Drazik, you don't have to live your life like this, killing, surviving. There's more." Drazik's mind struggled to grasp what he was saying. More. There had never been more. Since the moment she had been born into the caste of warriors, her existence had been singular in purpose. Every lesson, every mission, every victory was a step toward the ultimate goal, the survival of her species through the annihilation of their enemies. To her people, emotions were distractions, empathy was weakness. Everything she had been taught told her that she should reject this human's words, that she should reject the very notion of peace or anything outside of her mission. But the strange warmth radiating from his hand, the way his gaze held hers with a softness she had never encountered before, made her feel vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, she found something she had never expected: desire. Not just desire for him, for this human who had shown her something no one else had, but a desire for something greater than the life she had been forced to live. "What do you know about my kind?" Drazik growled, her voice harsher than she intended, as if she were trying to convince herself that she still held the upper hand. "We're not like you. Humans don't feel like this." Corin didn't flinch at her tone. He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat of his body, the weight of his presence grounding her in this new, terrifying reality. His hand moved to her shoulder, his thumb tracing the edge of one of her ridged scales. The sensation sent a shiver through her, and she hated how much she craved more of it. "Maybe that's what they've told you," Corin said softly. "But you're here, standing with me, and I can see it in your eyes. You do feel it. You've just been told for too long that you're not supposed to." Drazik opened her mouth to argue, to tell him that he didn't understand her people, that he was naive for thinking this moment meant anything beyond a strange anomaly. But the words caught in her throat because deep down she knew he was right. Her body had never reacted this way before. She had never wanted to let her guard down in front of an enemy, much less touch one. But Corin had stirred something in her that she couldn't control, and that scared her. If she allowed herself to feel, if she allowed herself to explore this strange connection, what would that mean for her mission, for everything she had ever known? "I don't know how to feel this," Drazik admitted, the words coming out before she could stop them. Her eyes flashed with frustration and confusion. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." Corin's hand slid up her arm, a slow, deliberate movement that sent warmth flooding through her cold-blooded veins. His touch wasn't forceful, it was patient, as if he knew she needed time to understand what was happening between them. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said. "But maybe just for this moment, you can stop being what they made you and just be you." Drazik's breath hitched at the words. Just be. She had never thought of herself as something separate from the USA war machine. Her identity was built around her role, around her ability to carry out orders and execute missions without question. But Corin was offering her a chance. No, he was offering her freedom from that. Freedom from the rigid structure of her life, from the endless cycle of violence that had defined her existence. Her hands, which had once been poised to kill him, now rested lightly against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. That sound, so foreign and yet so comforting, calmed something wild and restless inside her. For the first time, she let herself lean into that warmth, that human warmth, and the cold, rigid walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She looked up at him, her red eyes softening, though still filled with confusion. "What happens if I choose this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens if I choose you?" Corin's gaze held hers, unwavering and full of quiet strength. "Then we figure it out together. Together." The word felt strange on her tongue, but it was also hopeful. Drazik had always been alone, even among her own people. Her kind didn't form bonds the way humans did. They were solitary warriors focused solely on the mission. But here, standing in the ruins of a human city with Corin's hand still resting gently on her arm, Drazik realized she didn't want to be alone anymore. Without thinking, she leaned closer, her breath mingling with his as their faces hovered just inches apart. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild, unfamiliar rhythm that made her feel alive in a way she never had before. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't fully understand the emotions swirling inside her, but she knew that in this moment, she wanted to be close to him. Corin didn't pull away. His breath was steady, his eyes locked on hers. For the first time, Drazik felt a deep connection to something other than her mission. It wasn't about survival anymore. It wasn't about the war. It was about them, two beings standing on the precipice of something new. She closed the distance between them, her forehead resting against his as her eyes fluttered shut. The warmth of his skin against hers, the steady beat of his heart, and the soft sound of his breath filled the silence between them. And for that moment, the war, the missions, and the violence faded into nothingness. "I'm scared," Drazik whispered, the admission barely audible. Her voice trembled with vulnerability, a vulnerability she had never allowed herself to feel before. "I am too," Corin replied softly, his hand gently cupping the back of her head, his fingers threading through the ridges of her scales. "But we're in this together." And in that moment, Drazik felt something awaken inside her. It wasn't just desire. It wasn't just the thrill of being close to him. It was something far deeper. It was a new understanding of herself, a realization that she didn't have to be defined by the war, by the violence, by her past. She could choose something else. She could choose him. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, Drazik knew that everything had changed. The mission, the war, it all seemed so small now. What mattered was the choice she had made. The choice to be more than just a weapon, the choice to be human.